I was brutally beaten by a racist police officer, simply because I am a black doctor who saves children's lives. He ruined my reputation, leaving thousands of patients without vital medicine. But when his own child fell ill with the very disease that I had the cure for, he came to me on his knees, begging for help. What I did in that moment would surprise everyone, even those who had seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. As the plane touched down, I glanced out the window at the green fields, blanketing the landscape around the small provincial town. This wasn't New York, and it certainly wasn't Washington, the cities I was used to. Everything here looked too peaceful, too monotonous. Provincial, I thought. And with that came a strange sense of unease. What could possibly go wrong? After all, I'd come here to finalize a contract that was the culmination of my life's work. The medicine I had worked on for more than 10 years was finally ready to hit the market. Thousands of children around the world were waiting for this drug, waiting to be saved. But something inside me told me it wouldn't be easy. My entire journey had never been easy. I had fought to get my degree, fought to be taken seriously in the scientific community, where too often they heard only one thing, that I was a black scientist. And now I was here, in this quiet town, where it seemed no one had heard of my accomplishments, and where my mission to save lives felt distant from the reality of those around me. As I left the airport and got into the rental car, my thoughts flooded with memories of home, of my son. He was likely at home alone now, though he should have been at school. He struggled. He had always struggled without me. As a father, I knew I was letting him down, but as a scientist, I couldn't stop when I was so close to success. Negotiations lay ahead, but something about this day felt off. I couldn't explain it, but with every turn of the wheel, the anxiety grew stronger. The day passed in a haze. Negotiations with the pharmaceutical company went smoothly enough, but the tension in the air didn't lift. Everything seemed too smooth. We discussed contracts, pricing, licenses. People smiled, talked about prospects, but no one in that room seemed to understand that this contract was not just business for me. It was a chance to save lives. Their cold eyes and even tones irritated me, but I kept my calm. Finally, when it was time to head back to the hotel, I felt drained. The tension of the day, the emotional exhaustion, and the heavy thoughts of my son merged into one. The car moved down the empty road through the center of town. I tried to focus on the positive. Tomorrow was a signing, which meant an end to this anxiety. But suddenly, the lights of a police car flashed behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. I pulled over and rolled down the window. The officer stepped out slowly, making his way toward me. His appearance immediately set something off in me. A large white man, with a disgruntled expression and hard features. He resembled those I'd encountered before, people whose eyes never lingered on my face longer than they did on my skin color. "What's the issue?" I asked, keeping my voice steady. "License and registration." His voice was harsh and commanding, not even acknowledging my question. I silently handed him my driver's license and rental papers. He looked them over, his brows furrowing. He clearly didn't like that everything was in order. It's always the same. They need to find fault in you, even when there is none. The cop began asking stupid questions. Where I was coming from, where I was going. I answered curtly, without emotion, though I could feel anger bubbling inside me. Why should I have to explain myself? Why should I have to justify simply driving down a street? "Step out of the vehicle," he suddenly ordered. "Excuse me, but there's no reason for that." I could already see where this was headed, and my voice turned colder. The cop tensed. I saw him wrestling with an internal rage. For him, this was a challenge. And suddenly he lunged forward. His hands grabbed my collar, and before I could react, I was face down in the dirt. Rough hands twisted my wrists, and the cold metal of handcuffs bit painfully into my skin. The station's dim light and damp air enveloped me. They left me alone, like an unwanted object. This feeling was familiar, but never this painful. With each passing minute, I realized more and more that I was trapped in a snare I'd never been able to fully avoid, a trap that awaited me at every corner, simply because of who I was. Sitting on the bench in the cell, I replayed the last few hours in my head. Logan Barrett, the cop who decided I was a criminal, without even glancing at my work, my education, my accomplishments. His hatred was faceless, like a wall. To him, I was just another black man to be put in his place. He humiliated me, beat me, and dumped me here like garbage. I tried to stay strong, but the anger overwhelmed me. I thought about my son, to whom I had promised to be a role model. I thought about my mother, who always told me to rise above prejudice. But how can you rise above when they break you and drag you through the mud? I realized that ahead of me wasn't just a fight for the contract. It was a battle for my honor, for my right to be here, in this world where every step was in question. The cell door opened and Logan walked in. His gaze was full of satisfaction. He had won this battle, and I knew it. He approached, and I felt something dark swelling in my heart. This is it. His voice was like a sentence. You brought this on yourself. But I already knew I hadn't lost. I couldn't let him or this town destroy what I had built. The medicine, it was more important than his hatred. I lifted my head and met his gaze. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I would fight for myself, for all the children who could be saved. When he left, I understood. Tomorrow something new would begin. But the most terrifying thought was that no one in this town would come to help. I was alone in this fight. And that feeling, being alone in a world where you are an outsider, was the most painful thing I had ever experienced. This is the beginning of a powerful journey that unfolds over the course of the series, tackling issues of race, prejudice, and the resilience of the human spirit. The morning greeted me with a chill and a weight in my soul. When they finally released me from the cell, I stood at the threshold of the police station, feeling like the world around me had suddenly changed. Every glance, every face passing by seemed to pierce my skin like needles. Their silence spoke louder than words. I was an outsider, and now it was obvious not only to me, but to them too. They didn't know who I was, what I had done, or what I was trying to do. All they saw was what they had read in the headlines or heard from their neighbors. That was enough for them to see me as a threat. The town was whispering. Even as I walked back to the hotel slowly, with my head down, I could feel the conversation stop as I passed by, only to resume after I was out of earshot. They may not have known all the details, but they didn't care. A black man arrested. That was enough. Their faces bore judgment. They saw me not as a savior, not as a scientist, but as someone to be kept at arm's length. Saying that it hurt would be an understatement. I had lived a life constantly proving my worth. Every achievement, every victory in science seemed like it should protect me from this. But here in this town, all of that was meaningless. It was as if this place was a different world altogether, where the color of my skin was a sentence. But the real weight fell on my shoulders when I received a call from the company. Their tone was emotionless, but the message was devastating. I was summoned for another round of negotiations. My arrest had become a problem they couldn't ignore. I knew what was coming. Pressure. An attempt to smooth everything over, to back away from the partnership. It was worse than anything, because the medicine needed to hit the market as soon as possible. But now, everything was at risk. I couldn't let that happen. I arrived at the company's office, feeling like I was walking into an execution. Corporations rarely care about moral issues. They only care about money and reputation. And I knew that my arrest had become a burden for them. The looks from the staff, the barely noticeable whispers, everything indicated that my reputation had already seriously faltered, even though formally I hadn't been charged with anything. When I entered the meeting room, I was greeted by a group of people, including the company's lawyer, who was clearly leading the discussion. They didn't want long conversations. I could feel the tension between us building like a volcano ready to erupt. I sat across from them, trying to maintain my composure, though inside I was boiling. "Dr. Barrett," the lawyer began, adjusting his glasses, "we're not here to question your accomplishments, but you must understand that after your arrest, the situation has changed." I stayed silent, trying to gauge where they were headed, but what they said next didn't surprise me. "We are offering you a deal," he continued. "You drop any claims that may arise from the police incident, and we'll sign the contract." Quietly, without any fuss. I sat there in silence for a long time. My heart was pounding. They were trying to buy my silence, sweep the problem under the rug, as so often happens. But I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't just swallow this and walk away. This wasn't just about the contract. This was about who I was and what I was doing. My mission couldn't suffer because of the prejudice and violence I had been subjected to. And if I don't agree, I asked calmly, though inside I was burning. The lawyer hesitated, and for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. But then he put his business mask back on. "We will have to reconsider the terms of the partnership," he replied coldly. They thought they had intimidated me, but I was ready for anything. To me, this contract wasn't just a deal. It was a chance to save lives. And I wasn't going to back down. I walked out of the building with trembling hands. My thoughts were racing wildly, and I couldn't stop them. The company's offer felt disturbingly wrong. They weren't interested in the truth. They just wanted peace and quiet. For them, my fight with the system, with prejudice, was merely an inconvenience to be eliminated. But the scariest part was that they were ready to abandon everything I had offered if I didn't accept their terms. I felt the pressure tightening around me from all sides. On one side, my mission, the drug had to be released. On the other, my dignity. I was ready to take the hit, even prepared to face the destruction of my career if it meant I could change something. But this wasn't the time for that. I understood that if I agreed to their terms, it would mean betraying myself. A quiet ring from my phone broke my thoughts. My son's name lit up on the screen. I stared at it for a long time before answering. His voice was soft, as if he barely had the strength to speak. "Dad, are you coming back?" That simple question hit me harder than anything that had happened in the last few days. In his voice, I didn't just hear a question about my return. He was asking if I was coming back to him at all, to his life, to his problems. He needed me. And again, I felt the pain of being torn between who I needed to be as a scientist and who I needed to be as a father. I couldn't put it off any longer. The contract had to be signed. The drug had to be released. But I had to find a way to do it on my terms, without bending to the company's pressure. And in that moment, as I looked at the dark clouds gathering over the town, I realized that my fight was bigger than just a contract or my reputation. It was a fight for truth, for justice, for the future of my son, and for the future of the children I could save. I turned off the phone and headed back to the company's office with renewed determination. I sat in a small cafe in the center of town, mulling over everything that had happened in the past few days. This time, I didn't feel alone. I felt something else. It was like intuition, as if someone was watching my every step. Snatches of conversations, pieces of dialogue, and the faces of those who looked at me with suspicion or disdain flashed through my mind. I was a stranger here, but it felt like I was more than just an unwelcome guest. Everything that had happened to me, the arrest, the threats from the company, now started to form a larger picture. Amid the clatter of dishes and the murmur of voices, I caught fragments of conversations. People at nearby tables were talking about me, my arrest, my work. They were saying how I didn't fit into their little world. The town was whispering about me. But behind those whispers, something deeper was hidden, something personal that I couldn't quite grasp yet. I pulled out my phone and quickly skimmed news articles about Logan Barrett, an ordinary cop, unremarkable. But his hatred toward me had been too strong, too personal. Why had he been so determined to humiliate me, risking his career in the process? This question gnawed at me, and I felt I had to dig deeper. I was missing something. At that moment, an employee from the pharmaceutical company I had agreed to meet, would approach my table. He nervously glanced around, clearly not wanting to draw attention. We started with the usual topics: the contract, negotiations, possible prospects. But something in his voice made me tense. He spoke too cautiously, as if he was trying not to let slip an important detail. "There are rumors going around town," he finally said in a low voice, "about your conflict with Barrett. This isn't just coincidence, Malcolm. He has a personal stake in getting you out of here." "A personal stake?" I asked, not hiding my surprise. He nodded, his eyes lingering on me for a moment before dropping back to his coffee cup. "His son is sick," he said quietly, "with that rare disease your drug is meant to cure." Those words hit me like a shockwave. Logan's son was sick? And not just sick, but suffering from the very disease I had developed a drug for? This revelation should have cleared things up, but instead it only made things more complicated. I tried to process it all at once. Logan's hatred, his aggression, and now this knowledge. How could he hate me so much when my work could save his child's life? We continued the conversation, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I needed more information, and I knew I couldn't get it directly from Logan. He was clearly hiding his son's illness. Perhaps even the town didn't know about it, and there was something insane about it. Logan was willing to destroy my reputation, all while hiding that I could help him. After we finished the conversation, I left the cafe feeling even more lost. Now my emotions were tangled between anger and compassion. I had to figure out what to do next. But how? How could I help a man who had done everything to destroy me? Once again, I thought about my son. His call the night before reminded me that I was not just a scientist. I was a father. And as a father, I couldn't ignore a child suffering, even if his father hated me. I had to find Logan. I had to tell him the truth, even if it cost me the last shred of my dignity. Logan was sitting on a bench in the park when I found him. He didn't look surprised to see me. His face remained cold with the same impenetrable mask I had grown to know. But his eyes, there was something different in them. It was exhaustion mixed with fear. I sat down beside him at a respectful distance. We stayed silent for several minutes before I finally spoke. "I know about your son, Logan," I said softly. His reaction was immediate. His shoulders tensed, his fists clenched, but he didn't turn his head. He kept staring straight ahead, as if my words meant nothing. "My work," I continued, "is the only thing that can save him." Logan stood up sharply, his face twisted in anger, but his eyes, they screamed of pain. He stepped toward me, his breath heavy. "You don't understand," he growled. "You don't understand anything." "Then explain," I said firmly, holding his gaze. "Explain why you're willing to destroy me when you know I can help your son." He froze. Seconds passed like an eternity as Logan stood there as if battling himself. Finally, he turned and sat back down on the bench. Silence wrapped around us like a heavy blanket. "I can't, because that would mean admitting that everything I've done was wrong." Now everything made sense. His pride, his hatred. It had all been a way to protect himself from a truth he didn't want to accept. I saw it in every gesture, in every word. "This isn't about you, Logan," I said quietly. "It's about your son." He didn't respond, but I knew my words had hit home. Now it was up to him. I had extended my hand. But would he take it? The climax was near. I felt the air between us tighten, as if everything was holding its breath before something broke. With each passing day, I felt the town becoming more hostile. It wasn't just the pressure from Logan or the rumors swirling around me like a thick fog. No, it was something more, like the very air had turned heavier. People looked at me with suspicion. Their voices carried hidden accusations. Everyone whispered as if I were an enemy who had invaded their world with the intention of destroying it. But I knew the truth. I knew that my medicine children could save lives, not just here but around the world. And that was the only thing that gave me strength to keep going, even when the entire town seemed to have turned against me. My heart pounded in time with the ticking of the clock. I knew that the disease was claiming more children, and that time was my greatest enemy. But I also felt that I was running out of it. Logan had ramped up the pressure, no longer hiding his hatred. His face had become the embodiment of the fear I felt. He was determined to break me, as if my downfall could save him from his own demons. The town backed him. People saw me as an outsider, and that was enough justification for them. Justice had long been a part of my life, but here it felt more tangible than ever. Every morning, waking up in the hotel room, I checked the news, searched for ways to appeal to the authorities, to explain my mission. But my attempts were met with cold, indifferent stares. In return, silence. I made calls, requested meetings, but they all disappeared into the void. It was as if the town itself was saturated with prejudice like a sponge. I couldn't find support. It was as if this small world was deliberately pushing me away, refusing to let me break down the wall of mistrust and fear. I stood before the town administration building, staring at the gray walls behind which those who could decide the fate of my medicine were hiding. So many meetings had been scheduled, but none of them had taken place. The town officials avoided me, as if I were a contagion they'd rather not touch. I remembered my lawyer's words. He had warned me that public opinion could become the biggest obstacle, but I hadn't thought it would take on such proportions. How do you explain to people that you're here not to destroy their familiar world, but to save it? How do you make them understand that their prejudices stand in the way of saving their own children's lives? I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The meeting with one of the town officials that was supposed to take place had once again been canceled. I had grown accustomed to the cold stares of the secretaries and the empty promises to call me back. But today, standing at the door of the office, I felt especially defeated. "Dr. Barrett," I heard a voice behind me. I turned to see a young man. He was one of the administration staff I had met before at one of the early gatherings. His face looked concerned. "You should know." He glanced around as if afraid someone might overhear. "The pressure on you. It's not just prejudice. Some people have personal interests." "What do you mean?" I frowned, feeling there was something more behind his words. He hesitated, then continued. "The town officials, they support Barrett because his connections here run deeper than you think. They don't want you to sign the contract because it would jeopardize his reputation. But if they knew the medicine could save his son," I froze. Everything I knew was beginning to form a new picture. This wasn't just hatred. It wasn't just prejudice. Logan Barrett was tied to people whose interests and influence permeated the entire town. "His son is dying," the employee added quietly. "And without your medicine, he has no chance." That night, alone in my hotel room, I couldn't sleep. The hum of thoughts tore my mind apart. Everything I had learned, everything I had understood over the past few days, suddenly crashed down on me with relentless force. Logan Barrett wasn't just an enemy. He was a father, trying to hide his pain behind his hatred for me. His son was dying, and I was the only one who could save him. But why hadn't he come to me sooner? Why did he keep pushing me, trying to destroy everything I was building? Was it pride, or the fear that by asking for help, he'd admit his own weakness, his own guilt? These questions swirled in my head when the phone rang. An unexpected, quiet, insistent call. I picked up the phone. An anonymous number. My heart raced. I knew it could only be one thing. "We need to meet." The voice was muted, but I recognized it immediately. Logan. He didn't say anything else, just named the place and time. I felt a cold sweat go down my back, but not from fear, from the realization that this moment would change everything. His son was on the brink, and that had forced him to take a step forward. But what would come next? Would he be able to accept my help, or would his hatred prove stronger? I put on my coat and stepped out into the street. The town had fallen into a nighttime hush, but a storm raged in my heart. I walked to the meeting place, knowing that this conversation would be the point of no return. Time dragged slowly, as if the world around me had slowed down, anticipating something important. I stood at the window of my hotel, looking out at the empty street, lit only by a few scattered streetlights. The thought of the upcoming meeting with Logan weighed heavily on me, like a burden I couldn't shake. I had imagined this moment many times, standing face to face with a man who had tried to destroy everything I had built, who had humiliated me, oppressed me, showing the most vile form of prejudice. And now he was coming to me, not as an enemy, but as a desperate father. The hatred I felt for Logan still lingered inside me, boiling like hot water, but it was strangely mixed with something else. Pity for his son. The boy wasn't to blame for who his father was. I knew I couldn't deny help to a child, but what about Logan? Could I forget the humiliation he had forced me to endure? I couldn't ignore the way he had tarnished my name before the entire town, how he had fanned the flames of fear and hatred against me, a black man that this town would never accept. And yet now, his child's fate was in my hands. This was a moment of truth for both of us. Inside me, a war was waging. Hatred tried to silence the voice of reason. And yet I knew the decision I made today would shape not only the future of one child, but my own future as well. I took a deep breath and headed to the door. Logan Bear was waiting for me outside my hotel room. I knew this was going to be a conversation that would change everything. When I saw Logan in the parking lot outside the hotel, he looked different. This was no longer the confident cop I remembered. His shoulders were slumped, his face was drawn, and his eyes were filled with pain. For the first time, I saw him not as an enemy, not as a symbol of the system that tried to break me, but as a broken man, a father losing his son. He didn't speak immediately. We stood there facing each other, as if time had stopped and the words were stuck somewhere between desperation and pride. I saw him struggling with himself, and it only made the tension worse. He knew he wasn't coming to me as a scientist, but as his last hope. My son, he finally forced out, his voice shaking as if it physically hurt to say it. He's dying. I stayed silent. I had expected this moment, but hearing it from him was something else entirely. His words were simple, but behind them was a crushing weight that had been pressing on him day after day. Your medicine, it's his only chance, Logan continued, his voice cracking. He faltered, unable to finish. Inside me, everything churned. I understood his pain. I saw the desperation in his eyes, but I also saw that he wasn't ready to admit one thing. His hatred for me, his prejudice. And yet, here he was, standing before me, humbled and broken. I'll help your son, I said slowly, holding his gaze. But on one condition. Logan stiffened, his eyes flaring, but not with anger. It was more like fear. He knew I wouldn't just offer my help without a price. You have to admit the truth, Logan. Publicly, in front of everyone. He was silent, his face turning pale. I could see him wrestling with himself, with his pride, with the knowledge that to save his son, he would have to break himself. This moment was the most painful one for him. He would have to admit to himself, to the town, that he had been wrong all along. It's not about you, Logan, I said quietly. It's about your son. He didn't answer, but I knew my words had hit their mark. Now the choice was his to make. My hand was extended, but would he take it? This was the climax. The air between us was thick with tension, as if everything had frozen in place, waiting for something to give. Every day in this town felt heavier. It wasn't just Logan's hostility, or the rumors circling me. It was like the town itself had turned against me, closing in. The air was thick with suspicion and fear. Every glance I received carried with it 1,000 judgments, 1,000 silent accusations. People whispered as I walked by, their eyes saying everything their mouths didn't. I had become an enemy to them, a foreign presence in a world that wanted nothing to do with me. But I couldn't back down. I couldn't let their prejudice destroy what I had built. My medicine was ready, and it could save thousands of lives, including Logan's sons. And that thought was the only thing that kept me going. Even as the clock ticked down and the disease took more and more children, I knew I had to keep fighting. I had to, for the children who needed that medicine and for myself. The next morning, I woke to find an unexpected message waiting for me on my phone. A meeting with town officials had been arranged. Finally, after all the silence and avoidance, I had a chance to present my case. I arrived at the town hall, feeling the weight of what lay ahead. When I walked into the room, I saw familiar faces, the same officials who had avoided me for weeks, sitting around a polished conference table, their expressions unreadable. This was it, my chance to convince them that the medicine had to be released, that it was a matter of life and death. They listened, some nodding in agreement, others remaining cold and distant. I knew that for some of them, my words would never penetrate. To them, I was still an outsider, a threat to their world. But I had to believe that the truth would eventually break through. As the meeting wrapped up, I felt a sense of both accomplishment and dread. The decision wasn't final, but the fact that they were even listening gave me hope. Outside, I bumped into Logan. His expression had softened, and I could see in his eyes the weight of his son's condition. Without saying a word, he handed me a letter. It was a public statement of apology, addressed to the town. In it, Logan admitted to his prejudice, his actions against me, and his fear of accepting help from someone he had wronged. I read it in silence, feeling a mix of emotions. This wasn't just about an apology. It was about a man who had come to realize that his hatred had nearly cost him his son. I didn't know if it would change the town's opinion of me, but it was. A step toward healing, for Logan, for his son, and perhaps for this town. "I'll deliver it," Logan said quietly, his voice heavy with regret. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Later that evening, as I sat alone in my hotel room, I couldn't help but think about everything that had happened. The town, the fight for my reputation, the battle to release the medicine, it all felt like a distant memory now. The only thing that mattered was that the medicine was finally going to be released, and it would save lives. The next day, Logan delivered his apology to the town. It was met with mixed reactions. Some people accepted it, while others remained skeptical, but for the first time since I had arrived, I felt a shift. It wasn't a victory, but it was a start. The medicine was released shortly after. Logan's son was the first to receive it, and slowly, as the days passed, I began to see the change in the town. People who had once looked at me with suspicion now approached me with gratitude. They had seen the truth, that my work was meant to save lives, regardless of race or background. Logan and I would never be friends, but we had come to an understanding. He had swallowed his pride for the sake of his son, and in doing so, had opened a door to something greater, understanding, and maybe, just maybe, hope. The streets of the town felt different now. They were the same buildings, the same people, but something had shifted. Maybe it was inside me. After I saved Logan's son, and after he publicly admitted his wrongs, I felt free. Free from the oppressive shadow of prejudice that had loomed over me for so long. But this wasn't the feeling of victory. There was no triumph here. It was more like a quiet sigh of relief. The changes in the town came unexpectedly fast. People no longer turned away when I passed by. Rumors of my saving a child's life began to spread, and with them came the realization that their prejudice had almost prevented me from completing my mission. It wasn't a complete transformation. Some still looked at me with caution, with suspicion. But something important had shifted in the air. It was the first crack in the wall that had surrounded this town. I knew that change doesn't always come quickly. Sometimes it drips slowly, drop by drop, like water eroding stone. But now, I was witnessing the walls breaking before my eyes. I felt it in people's words, in their looks, in how they now talked about Logan and his son. This silence after the storm was tense, but in it was something hopeful. Now everything depended on how I continued my path. This wasn't the end. It was a new stage for me and for the town. The news that I had signed a contract with the pharmaceutical company spread through the town like wildfire. This was what I had come here for. But along the way I had realized that my battle wasn't just about signing documents. My work, my medicine, It was meant to change the and now. The contract was signed and production of my drug began. To my surprise, Logan became one of the most active participants in the process. He had not only publicly admitted his mistakes, but he had decided to go further, to help with the distribution of the medicine. We would never be friends. That was impossible. Too much stood between us. But in this new context, we began to respect each other. He carried out his part of the work with a level of dedication that surprised me, and there was something strange about it. His coldness had melted away, and I saw more humanity in him now. One day, when we crossed paths at the company's office, Logan approached me. "I can't say that we'll ever be okay," he said without meeting my eyes, "but I'm grateful for what you did." I nodded, not knowing what to say. There was no triumph in his voice, no sense of victory. It was the voice of a man who had realized the weight of his mistakes and was now trying to make up for them. It was more than I could have ever expected from him. People began to see that the work I was doing affected everyone, regardless of their skin color or background. Gradually, with the success of the drug's distribution, I saw how the racial prejudices that had once seemed insurmountable began to fade. But I knew this was just the beginning. The culmination came when I stood in the town square, in front of the administration building. Townspeople gathered, local reporters, some from the pharmaceutical company. I hadn't expected this gathering, but I'd been invited to publicly acknowledge the contribution my medicine had made to saving lives. I wasn't looking for gratitude. My work had always been for the children, not for recognition. But now it felt necessary. The mayor stepped up and gave a long speech about the significance of my accomplishments. His words drifted past me. I stood there, watching the people in the crowd. I saw the same faces that had once turned away from me when I first arrived here. The same people who had whispered behind my back, who had supported Logan and his prejudice. Now, they were listening, some still with hesitation, with doubt, but others with curiosity. This was a new reality, a reality where my name was no longer synonymous with threat or outsider. I had become something more to them, a catalyst for change, one that could no longer be ignored. When the mayor finished his speech, I stepped up to the microphone. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, but I said only one thing. This is just the beginning. My words were simple, but they carried the essence of everything I had been through. This was indeed just the beginning. The fight against prejudice and injustice is a long journey, one that doesn't end with a victory in one town. It continues as long as there are those who face it every day. The crowd applauded, but inside, I felt only a quiet relief, not a victory, just another step forward. In that moment, I realized I hadn't just changed them, I had changed myself.